Vanessa Johnson sighed as she drove home after a long shift at Memorial Hospital. The clock on her dashboard read 11:30 p.m. As the director of community health programs, her days often stretched well beyond normal working hours. Tonight had been particularly challenging. Budget meetings followed by an emergency staffing issue that needed her immediate attention. The flashing blue and red lights appeared suddenly in her rearview mirror. Vanessa checked her speed. She was going exactly at the limit. Still, she signaled and pulled over to the shoulder of the quiet suburban road, following the procedure she knew by heart. She rolled down her window and waited, hands visible on the steering wheel. The cool night air drifted in as she watched the officer approach in her side mirror. Her heartbeat quickened slightly. These encounters always made her nervous, despite having done nothing wrong. License and registration, the officer demanded without introduction. His flashlight beam struck her directly in the eyes, making her squint. "Good evening, officer," Vanessa replied politely, reaching slowly for her purse. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" Officer Mike Brennan didn't answer her question. Instead, he watched her movements with unusual intensity. "Hurry it up," he snapped. Vanessa handed over her documents. "I'm just coming home from work at Memorial Hospital," she explained calmly. "I don't believe I was speeding or breaking any traffic laws." The officer scanned her license. "This vehicle was seen swerving," he said flatly. "That's not possible," Vanessa replied, maintaining her composure. "I've been driving very carefully." Officer Brennan's expression hardened. "Step out of the car." Confused but compliant, Vanessa unbuckled her seatbelt. "May I ask why that's necessary, officer?" "You people always think you know better than law enforcement," Brennan muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. He opened her door roughly. "I said get out." Vanessa's stomach tightened at his words. She stepped out slowly, her professional blazer catching slightly on the door. "I'm going to need you to take a sobriety test," the officer announced, though he hadn't mentioned alcohol before. "I haven't been drinking," Vanessa explained. "I've been at work all evening. You can call the hospital to confirm." "Hands against the car," Brennan ordered, ignoring her statement. When Vanessa hesitated for just a moment, trying to understand the escalating situation, Officer Brennan grabbed her arm. With unexpected force, he pushed her against her own car. "This is unnecessary," Vanessa stated firmly, wincing as her cheek pressed against the cold metal of her car roof. "I've been compliant and—" "Quiet," Brennan shouted, applying more pressure than needed as he roughly patted down her sides. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for." "What description?" Vanessa asked, her professional demeanor giving way to justified anger. "I'm a hospital administrator coming home from work." The officer leaned closer. "Just cooperate, and this will go faster." A passing car slowed down, its headlights illuminating the scene. Perhaps noticing the witness, Officer Brennan's demeanor changed abruptly. He stepped back. "Your taillight is out," he said curtly, though both of Vanessa's taillights were functioning perfectly. "Get it fixed immediately." He thrust her license and registration back into her hands and walked away without another word, leaving Vanessa standing beside her car, shaken and humiliated. As she carefully got back into her vehicle, hands trembling slightly, Vanessa noticed the name on the officer's badge, M. Brennan. She committed it to memory, determined that this encounter would not go unreported. What she couldn't possibly know at that moment was how significantly Officer Mike Brennan would feature in her professional life in the very near future. The morning after the incident, Vanessa sat at her kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold beside her laptop. She had barely slept. Each time she closed her eyes, she felt the cold metal of her car against her cheek and the officer's rough hands pushing her. "This needs to be documented," she said to herself, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Vanessa had already taken photos of the light bruising on her arm where Officer Brennan had grabbed her. Now she carefully typed up every detail of the encounter while it remained fresh in her memory. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Dr. Richard Torres, the hospital's chief executive officer. "Vanessa, I hope I'm not calling too early," he said, his voice energetic as always. "Not at all, Richard. I've been up for hours," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Excellent. I wanted to give you some exciting news before the official announcement." The board approved our new community health initiative, and you'll be leading it." Vanessa smiled despite her troubled mood. This project had been her proposal, a partnership between Memorial Hospital and local first responders to better serve vulnerable communities. "That's wonderful news," she said, genuinely pleased. "When do we start?" "We're scheduling the first meeting with police department representatives for next Monday. It's a big opportunity, Vanessa. This could become a model for other hospitals across the state." After ending the call, Vanessa returned to her laptop. With new determination, she completed her report about Officer Brennan's behavior and submitted it to the police department's Internal Affairs Division. She also sent a copy to her personal lawyer, just to be safe. "This isn't just about me," she whispered, hitting the send button. "This is about making sure it doesn't happen to someone else." By Monday morning, Vanessa had pushed the unpleasant encounter to the back of her mind. She strode confidently through Memorial Hospital's main entrance, greeting staff members as she made her way to the conference room. Today was about moving forward, launching a program that could genuinely help people. The hospital side of the team arrived first: 2 doctors, a social worker, and Vanessa herself. They arranged materials and prepared the presentation while waiting for the police representatives. At exactly 9:00 a.m., the conference room door opened. Captain Williams, whom Vanessa had met during previous community events, entered first. Behind him followed 2 officers in uniform. "Ms. Johnson, always a pleasure," Captain Williams said, extending his hand. "Allow me to introduce Officers Jenkins and Brennan. They'll be our primary liaisons for this initiative." Vanessa froze. Standing before her, looking equally surprised, was Officer Mike Brennan, the same man who had pushed her against her car just days ago. Their eyes met, and recognition dawned on his face. For a split second, his confident expression faltered. Vanessa gathered herself quickly, shaking hands with each officer, including Brennan. Her palm felt cold against his, but her grip remained firm. "Pleased to meet you all," she said evenly. "I look forward to our collaboration." Throughout the meeting, Vanessa maintained her professionalism, presenting the initiative with passion and clarity. Yet she couldn't help noticing Officer Brennan's discomfort whenever she spoke directly to him or when their eyes met across the table. As the meeting concluded, Captain Williams approached Vanessa. "The department is excited about this partnership, Ms. Johnson. Officer Brennan will be your main point of contact going forward." Vanessa nodded politely. "I look forward to working closely with Officer Brennan," she said, watching his reaction from the corner of her eye. Captain Williams smiled. "He's one of our best. You're in good hands." The irony of his words wasn't lost on Vanessa. As the police team left the conference room, Officer Brennan glanced back at her. This time there was uncertainty, perhaps even fear, in his eyes. Neither of them could have predicted this twist of fate. The woman he had mistreated was now effectively his boss for the foreseeable future. The week after the first meeting passed slowly for Vanessa. She buried herself in work, reviewing the community health initiative plans over and over. Her assistant noticed her distraction but didn't comment on it. On Friday afternoon, Vanessa's phone rang. It was Hannah from the hospital's legal department. "Vanessa, we received a call from the police department about your complaint," Hannah said, her voice careful and measured. "Already? I only filed it last week," Vanessa replied, surprised at the quick response. "They want to schedule a meeting to discuss it. Apparently, Officer Brennan has denied any wrongdoing." Vanessa leaned back in her chair, looking out her office window at the hospital parking lot below. "I'm not surprised," she said quietly. "There's something else," Hannah continued. "They mentioned that Officer Brennan is part of the new community health program. They're suggesting you might have personal reasons for filing the complaint." Vanessa's grip tightened on the phone. "The incident happened before I even knew he would be involved in the program." "I know that, but I wanted to prepare you. This might get complicated." After hanging up, Vanessa stared at the folder on her desk labeled Community First Responder Initiative. Inside were all the materials for Monday's follow-up meeting, the meeting where she would have to face Officer Brennan again. Monday arrived with gray skies and light rain. Vanessa arrived at the hospital early, reviewing her notes one last time. Today's meeting would focus on training needs for both medical staff and police officers. The clock struck 10:00 a.m., and right on time, there was a knock at her office door. "Come in," she called. Officer Mike Brennan entered alone, uniform crisp and posture straight. He closed the door behind him. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice stiff. "Captain Williams sends his apologies. He couldn't make it today, so I'll be representing the department." Vanessa gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Please have a seat." An uncomfortable silence filled the room as Officer Brennan sat down. He placed a folder on the desk between them but didn't open it. "Before we start," he said finally, "I think we should address the situation." "Which situation would that be, Officer Brennan?" Vanessa asked, her voice calm but firm. He shifted in his seat. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I've reviewed my bodycam footage from last week. My conduct was fully within protocol." "Bodycam footage?" Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "I'd be very interested to see that footage, especially the part where you pushed me against my car and made that comment about you people." Brennan's face flushed slightly. "The camera may have malfunctioned during parts of our interaction." "How convenient," Vanessa said. She opened her desk drawer and removed a small voice recorder. "I've been recording all my traffic stops for years, Officer Brennan, a habit I developed after my brother was wrongfully arrested during a routine stop." This wasn't true. She had no recording. The bluff worked. Brennan's confident expression crumbled. "Look, Ms. Johnson," he said, lowering his voice, "I didn't know who you were that night. Things had been tense. We'd had reports of drug activity in that area, and that justified your behavior." Vanessa asked, leaning forward. "Would you have treated a white woman the same way?" The question hung in the air between them. Brennan looked down at his hands. "I don't want to damage this program before it even starts," Vanessa continued. "It's too important for our community. And make no mistake, Officer Brennan, I will not pretend that night never happened." He finally met her gaze. "What do you want from me?" "I want what I've always wanted, for people like you to do better. To recognize your biases and work to overcome them." She opened the folder on her desk. "Now, shall we discuss the training protocols? Unless you prefer, I request another liaison officer." The threat was clear. Brennan stiffened, then nodded slowly. "No, that won't be necessary," he said quietly. "I can work with you on this." "Good," Vanessa replied, turning to the first page. "Then let's begin." The Community Health Initiative was gaining momentum. 3 weeks had passed since Vanessa and Officer Brennan's private meeting in her office. During this time, they maintained a strictly professional relationship, speaking only when necessary about project details. Today, however, everything would change. Vanessa stood in the hospital's small conference room, arranging papers for the afternoon meeting. The door opened, and Dr. Torres walked in with a concerned expression. "Vanessa, you have a minute?" he asked, closing the door behind him. "Of course, Richard. What's wrong?" He sat down heavily in one of the chairs. "I just got off the phone with Chief Peterson from the police department. Your complaint against Officer Brennan has become complicated." Vanessa stopped organizing her papers. "What do you mean by complicated?" "The department claims there's insufficient evidence to support your allegations. They're suggesting the complaint be dismissed." He paused, looking uncomfortable. They'd also mentioned that it could appear as a conflict of interest, given your position overseeing the initiative. Vanessa felt a flash of anger, but kept her voice steady. "So they're implying I filed a false complaint to gain leverage over Officer Brennan." "They didn't say that directly, but that's what they want people to think," she finished for him. Dr. Torres sighed. "I'm sorry, Vanessa. I know you wouldn't make something like this up, but without evidence." "I understand," she said, though her clenched jaw suggested otherwise. "Thank you for letting me know." After Dr. Torres left, Vanessa stood alone in the conference room, trying to collect her thoughts. The unfairness of it all burned inside her. She had followed every proper channel, done everything by the book, and yet the system was protecting Brennan. When the door opened again 20 minutes later, Officer Brennan walked in alone. "Ms. Johnson," he greeted her with a nod. "The others will be here shortly." Vanessa looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since their encounter on the dark roadside. He seemed smaller somehow, less intimidating in the bright light of the conference room. "I just heard from Dr. Torres," she said directly. "Your department is dismissing my complaint." Brennan shifted his weight but maintained eye contact. Yes, I was informed this morning. And do you think that's just? He hesitated before answering. The department made its decision based on available evidence. Or lack thereof, Vanessa countered. Convenient how your body cam wasn't working. Brennan's face reddened slightly. Look, Ms. Johnson. No, you look, Vanessa interrupted, her voice low but intense. We're about to start a program that relies on trust between healthcare workers and police officers. How can I trust you when you refuse to acknowledge what happened that night? The tension in the room was palpable. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, Brennan broke the silence. What do you want from me? A public confession? My resignation. I want accountability, Vanessa replied simply. I want you to understand what it felt like to be treated that way because of the color of my skin. Something changed in Brennan's expression, perhaps the realization that this wasn't going away, that Vanessa Johnson wasn't going to quietly drop the matter. There are two ways we can proceed, Vanessa continued. Either I request another liaison officer explaining exactly why I can't work with you, or what? Brennan asked when she paused. Vanessa took a deep breath. Or you agree to attend the implicit bias training sessions we're developing, not just as a liaison, but as a participant. You acknowledge, at least to me, that your conduct that night was inappropriate, and you commit to doing better. Officer Brennan looked stunned. Of all the responses he might have expected, this wasn't one of them. You'd still work with me, after what happened. This program is bigger than either of us, Vanessa said firmly, but I need to know you're willing to change. Before Brennan could respond, they heard voices in the hallway. The rest of the team was arriving. Think about it, Vanessa said, gathering her papers. Let me know your decision by tomorrow. As the door opened and people began filing in, Officer Brennan's eyes remained on Vanessa, seeing for the first time not just her authority, but her integrity. The next morning, Vanessa arrived at her office earlier than usual. Sleep had eluded her as she replayed yesterday's confrontation with Officer Brennan in her mind. Would he accept her terms, or would his pride force her to request a new liaison? She was reviewing reports when her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. Can we meet? Outside the hospital. Brennan. Vanessa frowned. She hadn't given him her personal number. He must have obtained it from the contact list for the initiative. The boundary crossing irritated her, but she was curious about his response. The coffee shop across the street. 9:30, she texted back. At precisely 9:30, Vanessa sat at a corner table in the small cafe, watching Officer Brennan through the window as he approached. He was in civilian clothes, jeans and a gray sweatshirt, making him look younger, less imposing. Thank you for meeting me, he said, sliding into the chair across from her. He placed a small envelope on the table. I wanted to give you this in person. Vanessa opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a formal request for transfer from the Community Health Initiative, citing personal reasons. So this is your answer, she said, disappointment evident in her voice. You're running away. Brennan leaned forward. I'm not running away. I'm doing what's best for the program. You said it yourself. This initiative is bigger than either of us. And the bias training? Our agreement. There was no agreement, he said, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. You gave me an ultimatum. Vanessa placed the paper back in the envelope. I gave you an opportunity, Officer Brennan. An opportunity to learn and grow. Look, he said, lowering his voice, I've been on the force for 8 years. I've worked in neighborhoods you wouldn't set foot in. I've seen things that would keep you up at night. That doesn't justify what happened. I followed protocol during that traffic stop, he insisted. Maybe I was a bit rough, but the area had seen increased drug activity. I was being cautious. Cautious? Vanessa repeated incredulously. You pushed me against my car for no reason. You made a comment about you people. What exactly did you mean by that, Officer Brennan? His jaw tightened. You're twisting my words. Am I? Or are you refusing to acknowledge your own biases? They stared at each other across the small table, the coffee between them growing cold. My father was a cop, Brennan said suddenly. So was his father. It's all I ever wanted to be, to serve and protect. And now you're painting me as some kind of racist. I never used that word, Vanessa replied calmly. But your actions that night speak for themselves. Brennan's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then stood up abruptly. I need to go. The transfer request is there if you want to use it. Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving Vanessa alone with the envelope and her thoughts. Later that afternoon, Vanessa sat in Captain Williams' office at the police station, the transfer request in her hand. Officer Brennan is one of our best, Captain Williams said, leaning back in his chair. I'm surprised he wants to leave the initiative. Did something happen? Vanessa chose her words carefully. We have different perspectives on certain matters. This wouldn't be related to your complaint, would it? Because that matter has been closed. Has it? Vanessa asked. Or has it simply been dismissed? Captain Williams frowned. Ms. Johnson, I understand you're upset, but without evidence. What about the dashcam? Vanessa interrupted. Officer Brennan mentioned his body cam malfunctioned, but surely the dashcam captured the incident. The captain's expression changed slightly. The dashcam footage is part of an ongoing internal review. So there is footage, Vanessa said, realization dawning. And you've seen it. Captain Williams didn't confirm or deny this. Instead he asked, What do you want, Ms. Johnson? Do you want Officer Brennan punished? Fired? Vanessa shook her head. I want accountability, Captain, and I want this initiative to succeed. She placed the transfer request on his desk. I'm not accepting this. Officer Brennan stays on the project. The captain looked surprised, even after everything that's happened. Especially after everything that's happened, Vanessa replied, standing up. Sometimes, the hardest conversations are the most necessary ones. As she left the station, Vanessa felt a renewed sense of purpose. Officer Brennan could deny the truth all he wanted, but running away wouldn't solve anything. The real work, the important work, was just beginning. The weekly meeting of the Community Health Initiative fell into an uncomfortable routine. Officer Brennan attended as required, speaking only when necessary. Vanessa maintained her professional demeanor, never mentioning their private conversations. The tension between them was obvious to everyone, though no one dared ask what had happened. On Wednesday afternoon, Vanessa was reviewing training materials in her office when her phone rang. It was Hannah from Legal. Vanessa, you need to come to my office right now, Hannah said, her voice unusually serious. What's happening? Vanessa asked, already gathering her things. The police department sent over some files. I think you should see them in person. 15 minutes later, Vanessa sat in Hannah's office, staring at a computer screen. On it was footage from Officer Brennan's patrol car dashcam from the night of their encounter. The angle wasn't perfect, but it clearly showed Brennan pushing Vanessa against her car with unnecessary force. More damning was the audio. His words came through clearly. You people always think you know better than law enforcement. They sent this to us? Vanessa asked, stunned. Hannah nodded. Captain Williams forwarded it this morning with a note saying the internal review has been reopened. But why now? They were so quick to dismiss my complaint before. Someone higher up must have intervened, Hannah suggested. This kind of evidence can't be ignored. Vanessa sat back in her chair, processing this development. The vindication she should have felt was overshadowed by a more complex emotion she couldn't quite name. The next day, Vanessa found a note on her desk asking her to come to the police station at 4 p.m. When she arrived, she was shown into a conference room where Captain Williams waited with another man in a suit. Ms. Johnson, this is Deputy Chief Rodriguez, Captain Williams introduced. He's overseeing the internal review of your complaint. Deputy Chief Rodriguez shook her hand firmly. Thank you for coming, Ms. Johnson. I've reviewed the dashcam footage and your original statement. I want to apologize for the delay in addressing this matter properly. What changed? Vanessa asked directly. The two officers exchanged glances before Deputy Chief Rodriguez answered. An anonymous officer submitted a report expressing concern about similar behavior from Officer Brennan in other encounters. So you needed more than just my word, Vanessa observed. Unfortunately, that's often the case, he admitted. But now we have clear evidence of misconduct. Captain Williams leaned forward. Officer Brennan has been placed on administrative leave pending a full review. He will also be required to attend comprehensive bias training. And the Community Health Initiative. Vanessa asked. We'll assign a new liaison officer immediately, Captain Williams assured her. Vanessa took a deep breath. I appreciate the action you're taking now, but I'd like Officer Brennan to remain on the project. Both men looked surprised. Are you certain? Deputy Chief Rodriguez asked. After what happened? The purpose of this initiative is to bridge gaps and improve understanding between communities and law enforcement, Vanessa explained. Removing Officer Brennan now would defeat that purpose. That's very generous of you, Captain Williams said carefully. It's not about generosity, Vanessa replied. It's about creating real change, but I do have conditions. His participation in the bias training needs to be serious and meaningful, and he needs to acknowledge his actions that night. Deputy Chief Rodriguez nodded slowly. I'll speak with him, but I can't guarantee he'll be receptive. You don't need to guarantee anything, Vanessa said, standing up. Just make sure he sees the dashcam footage. The truth speaks for itself. As she left the station, Vanessa felt lighter somehow. The evidence had validated her experience, but she knew this was just the beginning of a much longer, more difficult conversation, one that needed to happen not just with Officer Brennan, but within the entire system. 1 week passed with no sign of Officer Brennan. The Community Health Initiative continued with a temporary liaison officer, a friendly woman named Officer Chen who brought fresh energy to the project. Vanessa found herself wondering if she had made the right decision in requesting Brennan's return. On Monday morning, Vanessa arrived at her office to find a plain white envelope on her desk. Inside was a handwritten note. Can we talk? 12 p.m. at the park bench behind the hospital. Brennan. All morning, Vanessa debated whether to go. Part of her wanted to simply move forward with Officer Chen as the permanent liaison. Yet another part recognized that unresolved issues rarely stay buried. At noon, she walked to the small park behind the hospital where employees sometimes ate lunch. Officer Brennan sat alone on a bench, still in civilian clothes. He looked different somehow, less confident, more thoughtful. Thank you for coming, he said as she approached. Vanessa sat beside him, leaving space between them. I wasn't sure I would. I wouldn't blame you, he replied, looking down at his hands. I've seen the dashcam footage. A moment of silence passed between them. Deputy Chief Rodriguez tells me you requested I stay on the initiative, Brennan continued. Why? Vanessa considered her answer carefully. Because removing you would be easy. The hard work is changing the system that allowed what happened to occur in the first place. Brennan nodded slowly. I've been doing a lot of thinking during this suspension, about that night, about how I acted. He paused. I was wrong. The admission hung in the air between them. I could make excuses, he continued. Talk about the stress of the job, or how we'd had reports of drug activity in that area. But the truth is simpler and harder to face. I saw you, a black woman in a nice car, and I made assumptions. Assumptions that led to actions, Vanessa added. Yes, he agreed. Actions I'm not proud of. A light breeze rustled the leaves overhead. In the distance, an ambulance siren wailed briefly then faded. I grew up in a police family, Brennan said after a while. My father, my uncles, all cops. I wanted to be just like them. But looking back, I can see now that some of their attitudes weren't right, and I carried those with me without questioning them. Recognition is the first step, Vanessa said, but it can't be the only one. Brennan turned to face her directly. I've enrolled in the bias training program, not just because I was ordered to, but because I want to be better. I want to learn. And the initiative? Vanessa asked. If you'll still have me, I'd like to continue, not just as a liaison, but as someone committed to making real change, in myself and in the department. Vanessa studied his face, looking for any sign of insincerity. She saw only genuine remorse and determination. It won't be easy, she warned him. There will be people who won't understand why I'm giving you a second chance. I know, he acknowledged. And I know I need to earn it. Vanessa stood up, ready to return to the hospital. The next initiative meeting is tomorrow at 10 a.m. Officer Chen has been doing an excellent job in your absence. Brennan stood as well. I'll be there, and Vanessa, he stopped himself. Ms. Johnson, thank you. Don't thank me yet, Officer Brennan, she replied. The real work is just beginning. As Vanessa walked back to the hospital, she reflected on the complicated path that had brought them to this point. There were no guarantees that Brennan would follow through, that real change would happen. But for the first time since that night on the roadside, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel: hope. The reckoning had begun, not just for one officer, but potentially for an entire system that needed to face its flaws before it could truly heal. 6 months passed since Officer Brennan's return to the Community Health Initiative. What had begun as an uncomfortable partnership gradually evolved into something neither Vanessa nor Brennan could have predicted: mutual respect. The initiative itself had exceeded everyone's expectations. Emergency room visits from underserved neighborhoods decreased by 15%. Police officers received training in recognizing mental health crises, while hospital staff learned better protocols for handling potentially dangerous situations. Today marked the official launch of the program's second phase. The hospital auditorium was filled with medical professionals, police officers, community leaders, and local media. Vanessa stood at the podium, surveying the diverse crowd with satisfaction. When we began this journey 6 months ago, many said it couldn't be done, that the gap between law enforcement and healthcare was too wide, that the distrust in our communities ran too deep. Her eyes found Officer Brennan in the audience, now wearing his full uniform again. He gave her a small nod of encouragement. But today, she continued, we've proven that meaningful change is possible when we commit to honest conversation and accountability. After her speech, Vanessa introduced Officer Brennan, who had been selected by his peers to speak on behalf of the police department. As he approached the podium, she noticed how differently he carried himself now: more humble, more thoughtful. My involvement with this initiative began in an unusual way, he started, glancing briefly at Vanessa. I made a mistake, a serious one that could have ended my career. Instead, it became the start of a journey I never expected to take. A hush fell over the room. Most people knew something had happened between Brennan and Vanessa, but the details had remained private. The bias training that is now required for all officers participating in this program changed me, Brennan continued. It forced me to examine assumptions I didn't even know I carried. It wasn't easy or comfortable, but it was necessary. After the ceremony, Vanessa found herself standing next to Brennan at the reception, both holding cups of sparkling water. That was quite a speech, she said. I didn't expect you to be so open about what happened. Neither did I, he admitted. But it felt right. If my story can help other officers recognize their own biases, then something good will have come from that night. Captain Williams approached them, accompanied by Dr. Torres. The mayor's office called, the captain announced. They want to expand the program to cover the entire city. That's fantastic news, Vanessa replied, genuinely pleased. There's more, Dr. Torres added. They're creating a permanent task force to oversee the expansion, and they want both of you to co-chair it. Vanessa and Brennan exchanged surprised glances. We'll need to think about it, Vanessa said. Later, as the reception wound down, Vanessa and Brennan found themselves alone in the hospital courtyard. So, Brennan said, breaking the silence, co-chairs? Quite a plot twist, Vanessa replied with a small smile. Do you think we could do it? Work together at that level after everything that's happened? Vanessa considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, I would have said no. But now, she paused. I've seen real change in you, Officer Brennan. Not just in words, but in actions. Mike, he said. After all we've been through, I think you can call me Mike. All right, Mike, she said, testing the name. I believe in second chances. I believe people can change when they truly want to. And I believe this work matters too much to walk away from it. So that's a yes. That's a let's try, she clarified. One day at a time. As they walked back inside, neither spoke of that night on the roadside. It would always be part of their shared history, a painful beginning that had led to an unexpected partnership. But now they looked forward, focused on the work ahead and the communities counting on them. The resolution wasn't perfect. Real life rarely offers neat, happy endings. Instead, it provides opportunities to learn, to grow, to do better. And sometimes, if we're fortunate, to help others do the same.